Looks like I'm up.
This is Vince to the Vanquish, Octagonia's local champion, role model and arachnophile. He fights in order to provide for the orphanage he grew up in. That's what he's best at and that's what he's known for. But Vince harbors a dark secret. He's a mass murderer. He also takes performance enhancing drugs, but that's negligible. Yet he doesn't seem to think so. When he collapses after years of slurping spider juice, he does so with a realization.
Man. I guess cheaters never prosper, huh?
But he didn't cheat. I don't remember the Luminary signing a contract saying that he didn't consume any strength seeds. Vince did take a shortcut to power, but there were no rules against doing so. In fact, it should be expected, because Octagonia's tournament is not regulated like a real-world martial arts tournament, which is why we can't make a judgment on what Vince did using real-world martial arts tournaments rule sets as a basis. A much closer real-world equivalent would be something like an untested powerlifting competition. Maybe not in form of the activity, but in terms of the ethicality of drug use. In case you don't know, some sports like bodybuilding and powerlifting have tested as well as untested divisions. The tested ones, as you might expect, include randomized drug tests, and that's where you go if you want to stay natural and away from drugs. In the untested divisions, there are no drug tests. If you compete there, it's expected that you do and take whatever gets you the best results. If Vince competed in a tested division of the tournament, then he'd be a cheater, no questions asked. But given how he fights in a competition where literally anything goes, where you can juice up on stat seeds, where having a stronger weapon or better armor is strictly advantageous, and where it's in the spirit of the competition to use consumables as long as it gets you the win, him using a stimulant is not in fact cheating. And if we look at the Japanese version, this line of his that cheaters never prosper was originally about how that's what he gets for relying on a monster's power. There's a big difference between the two. One line blames his presumed lack of sportsmanship and frankly sounds corny, the other blames his dependency on a rectagon. Personally, I see the Japanese version's line as much more reasonable. Vince's drug use in a vacuum isn't cheating and arguably isn't even bad. If the medium through which he was destroying his body was a special technique like Goku's Kaioken instead of drugs, then it would be seen as a noble self-sacrifice. There's something to be said about him not being open about his drug use, and there's still the question of whether self-harm is inherently immoral, but that's far too extensive, so I'll just say that ethically, taking drugs that destroy your body for a greater good is morally ambiguous. And for him it was the right choice. It's killing him, but he would have gladly died for the kids. The circumstances that made him willing to trade his life for some cash are the real root of all problems, not simply the drug. And that's where a rectagon comes in, like a loan shark with extra steps. Vince's biggest mistake was not becoming dependent on drugs, it was becoming dependent on the monster controlling their supply. Dragon Quest stories have many parallels to folklore and fairy tales, and the common motif of deals with the devil is just one of many examples. And Dragon Quest understands that subversions are not always necessary, it's sometimes enough to have an interesting realization of a trope, and that's exactly what this is. Vince was in need of money and gave in to temptation when a rectagon reached out to him, made the pact to bring it people as food, and that's where he went wrong. He made a deal with a monster that he should never have trusted. The immoral action was that he brought people to a rectagon as food, it wasn't that he broke a non-existing rule of a tournament. The line in the English version feels for kids-esque. It's a cheap moral lesson about how cheating is bad, regardless of if it fits. But I can't blame it, and that is because of my only gripe with Vince's story. Dragon Quest XI tackles a lot of its location's themes from different angles over the different visits. Addiction, or more specifically dependency, and this dark side of entertainment are what define Octagonia. That's why, while I do understand why they did it, I'm a bit disappointed the writers only glance over his drug use, only focusing on how much power it gave Rectagon over him. With how Dragon Quest XI does it, it almost feels like the drugs don't matter. The game isn't really pushing its anti-drug message with anything resembling effort, and while that's understandable because of ratings, it also makes me feel like they could have cut the middleman and avoided opening up such a complex topic altogether. I.e., they could have made Rectagon the organizer or something, and Vince could only get booked for fights if he followed Rectagon's orders. But in the end, something that comes with the fairy tale vibe of Dragon Quest is that this cinema synth style criticism isn't applicable. You wouldn't complain that the prince in Snow White is a deus ex machina, and equally, Dragon Quest stories tend to in large part be about vibe more than coherence. And even without the actual in-game dialogue supporting it, drugs have a strong negative connotation. Vince didn't cheat, and the drug use is morally ambiguous if you have the full picture, but people are going to see a drug and think there's something bad going on since it's that powerful in image. Another downside to removing drugs from the equation would be that without them they couldn't have written this amazing moment at the end. After you defeat a Rectagon, you and Vince are set to receive your prizes for winning the tournament, but Vince challenges you to a fight.
Winner takes all!
He does so despite knowing that he has no chance of winning without drugs, and he loses. Badly. But on his way out, despite him doing his best to show people that he is nothing without the Rectagon's help, despite him trying to ruin his reputation, people still call him their champ and chant out his name as he walks into retirement. Up until now, he was physically strong, and while he hid it behind his stoicism, he was mentally weak, which led him to accept the Rectagon's offer. Here at the end, his stoicism breaks. His mental weakness and physical strength reverse. It's still very well made, but if they weren't so half-hearted on whether they wanted to talk about drug use or not, and if Booga in the revisit didn't suck so bad, Octagonia would be my favorite Dragon Quest XI area story-wise. And another small gripe I have is Act 3, but that goes for most events. Vince retired in Act 1 and he says that he never had any talent for fighting and could only do it thanks to a Rectagon. So why is his Act 3 self stronger than he ever was while drinking spider juice? It takes away so much from his decision if he was always able to just be that strong without even trying. The other aspect is that he fully recovered and then some. He doesn't have any withdrawal symptoms and in fact feels better than ever. The drug was supposed to be a physical representation of Vince's dependency on a monster, but it doesn't serve that purpose seamlessly since Vince is not addicted to the drug. That's what I mean when I say the game shouldn't have opened up this complex a topic if it didn't want to talk about it. Vince is a mass murderer, right? Not someone you'd expect to be a role model. But we don't see the people he killed, we only see the smiling faces of the orphans that admire him. We're supposed to feel sympathetic towards him after all. And if we leave out how he got them, the world is better off because Vince took those drugs. At least from a utilitarian standpoint, because the orphanage wouldn't exist anymore if he didn't sip on the spider juice. It was only thanks to that he was able to support it until a more permanent solution came around. Of course, if we consider that he killed people for those drugs, the world is worse off, but the takeaway is that killing or falling in with a bad crowd is bad. The drugs are only implicitly bad because they're drugs and we expect them to be bad. So I can understand the localizers feeling the need to attempt to not make it seem as if they're glorifying drug use. The English version, where at the climax of his story when Vince collapses he regrets cheating, is in my eyes worse, but I've come to understand that it isn't objectively so. It's a different version of the story, like the plays or manga adaptations there are for these games, even if the difference here is only a semantic one. And before we ask ourselves the question of whether the problem was that Vince cheated or whether it was that Vince trusted the Rectagon, the root of all evil at the time was Mordegon, possessing the king of Heliodor, who's responsible for not just the Rectagon but the socio-economic state of Octagonia that forced Vince to make the pact. And this is a bit of a problem with this sort of video, this sort of story discussion. There are elements that all tie into each other and it's impossible to paint anything resembling the full picture without elaborating for hours on end, so I'm just not going to.